Sure my microphone's working. There it is. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome. Today we are joined by Russ Mitchell. Russ, how are you doing today?
Good.
All right, fantastic. So, those of you who might not be familiar, Russ is a very accomplished swordsman who is an instructor and an author on many subjects, and especially, and one that I'm especially curious about, the author of Hungarian Hussar Sabre and Fokos Fencing, and I'm hoping I pronounced Fokos properly.
Hussar, yeah. No, Fokos, yes. The
Okay.
Hungarians pronounce S like sugar, so
Sugar.
easy peasy. Once you know that rule, Hungarian gets a lot easier to pronounce.
Perfect. I'll use that in mind next time I'm reading through your manual. Every time there's an S, I'll pronounce it with sugar. So, first question and most important one: are you drinking coffee, and is it good?
I am drinking coffee. It is Lavazza because my wife is a gourmand where coffee is concerned. It is good.
And
I am a student of Ogden Nash, and therefore I drink any kind of coffee no matter what. Ogden Nash's famous little bit of doggerel. Remember, son, long as you live, gourmet is not an adjective. There is a good coffee at any point. I will actually drink Nescafe without shame.
wow.
There are times when what you need is fuel fast. Other times when you want a really, really nice coffee. Lavazza is a great brand, so she's doing me much better than I deserve this morning.
Yeah, you're down in Texas right now, so you're
Yes, sir.
earlier than we are right now. So you're probably extra tired and extra looking forward to the caffeine boost once it kicks in.
I had a 12-year-old gleefully waking me up this morning because the tables were turned and it was her turn now.
Being a swordsman parent, I understand that as well. It is sometimes difficult. So, before we dive into the details of Hungarian stuff specifically, doing some research beforehand, I found that you have actually written quite a few other books on the subject of martial arts as well. What are some of the other books? Maybe some that our viewers might not be familiar with.
I did 2 young adult novels for my daughter and a couple of books on body mechanics. I am sort of a heretic in a lot of fencing and martial arts circles. I don't believe that techniques are fundamentals. I think there are fundamental movement patterns underneath that. And so my teaching is very, very body mechanics heavy. And I work with something that's called the Feldenkrais method, which is basically applied neurology for how you can do movement pedagogy. And I really, really drill into, oh, well, if you want to perform this technique, but you don't know the underlying physical prerequisites of the technique, we need to go back and do basics. And I spend a lot of time with those basics. So for example, I just put out a book called The Weightless Ribbon on how to learn how to fall and roll. I've taught that for years because I'd go to some place and people need to learn to do that. And the make your arm into a hoop and throw yourself at the ground and try not to hurt real bad approach, it doesn't work real well. People hurt a lot. It's not an accident that Aikido, the nonviolent martial art, has by far the highest injury rate. And that's when you count some of the really heavy hitting stuff. They're the guys who are getting torn up the most because why? They're falling a lot. And the learning process is steep. Also did a book called Driving with, it's also about body mechanics because if you drive long distances, as I sometimes do, you got to really think about the mechanics of how to do it if you want to get out of the car feeling as good as when you got in. And I figured out how to drive for 20 hours, get out of the car going, okay, what's next? Bed soon, I hope, but otherwise feeling good.
I really appreciate that you brought up.
Say again?
I really appreciate that you brought up the driving book, and especially how that relates to body mechanics, because I think that that's a prime example that martial artists can tell of how you can utilize the skills and the studies that we do in our, I suppose you'd say, in our practice to everyday life, especially now in the 21st century.
Absolutely. They have the supposed irony of the peaceful warrior, but by the time you've refined your body mechanics, you become immune to many of the stresses that freak folks out who don't have any training. Oh, terrible thing happens. Well, that's going to be an adventure and a pain in my butt. Okay.
So
Once you know how to use yourself better and you're not, say, throwing your elbow up all the time because you don't even know what you're doing with your arm. I have been at that place. You know, I can know where my body is and what I'm doing with it. Once you get past that and you get to a sense of, yeah, I know exactly what I'm doing with my body, and I know that I'm in a bad posture, and I know I'm in a bad posture for a specific reason, and I know how to get out of it later. Well, yeah, you can be a lot kinder to everybody else you love in your life when you're not trapped inside that horrible bad posture that's literally stressing you out.
that's fantastic. I love that. Let's before I continue, I do want to remind our multiple viewers right now, if you have any questions at any point during this presentation, please post them in the link if you're watching this live. In the comments, I do have them up here off to the side, so if you have a question, please post it, and we will try our best to answer it. So, shifting towards the martial arts aspect, you are an instructor, is that correct? Would you be able
Yes.
to tell us a bit about what you do?
I've taught for about 20 years, and basically I teach an obscure lineage of Hungarian Hussar swordsmanship. And it teaches the heavy saber and the Fokos, which is a kind of long-handled tomahawk. Here's an example. This is an earlier example, not one that would have been issued in World War I. So it's basically a tomahawk on a really long stick, and it relies on a lever arm for its power rather than lots of mass. Most Fokos heads are shockingly light, half to 3/4 of a pound. Sometimes the big ones go up to a pound, but almost never more than that. East Central European weapons, a great way of finding out if they're a replica or if they're original is to flip the Jurassic Park logic on its head. If it's light, it's probably real. If it's surprisingly light, it's probably authentic.
All right.
The lineage is complicated by the fact that World War II and World War I politics in East Central Europe were really cruel, and the lineages were sort of busted up and broken, and Austro-Hungarian fencing is weird. Unlike most other national programs, there was no unified national thing. If you were a master at arms, that was like being a professor of economics or whatever, and your classes were yours to run as you saw fit. So when the Italian fencing came in and the Hungarians and the Austrians went, that pedagogy is good stuff and the elbow cuts are useful, even after the official curriculum was officially Italian, you have lots of folks going, nope, we prefer the wrist moulinets, or we're going to make a hybrid of the two, or here's an M1904, this is a big hoss of a saber. And a bunch of folks are going, well, you know, you just can't really do elaborated fencing with an 1,100-gram blade. So they taught really, really basic stuff. And some folks you can see in very old pictures or videos, they're actually still teaching pure shoulder cuts for the cavalry because their point of view is that anything other than that on horseback is nonsense. And if you want to fence on your own time because you're obsessed with dueling, that's not my problem, buddy. So Austro-Hungarian fencing is really fascinating because it's got bits and pieces of everything, including its own characteristic techniques. And you really go person by person by person by person to see what they are.
So from that, I do want to dive into the book. This is fantastic. It's available on multiple places, Amazon specifically. That's where I got my copy. So let me ask from the beginning, what drew you to Hungarian fencing tradition to the point of wanting to share it with the world by publishing such a great book on the subject?
Well, I was a grad student studying 14th century Central European warfare and the Hussite Revolution in 15th century. And I know that's a great way to kill a cocktail party dead. I was studying this guy named Sigismund of Luxembourg for a while. And because of the Cold War, there was very, very little available in English that was either less than 70 years old, or B, hadn't been taken to task with the communists saying, here's your act, you will grind it, or you're out of a job and you'll work at a dairy farm for the rest of your life. Because the commies did that kind of thing. In fact, that's the nice version of what happened to you if you wrote down history they didn't like. So I kind of had to go to Hungary. So I went to grad school in Hungary at Central European University, and along the way, the guy who was my supervisor bumped me into a couple of other people, and the gentleman who brought me to see you said, "Hey, I know you're into experimental archaeology, and I know you're into old weapons. I happen to know a guy." And he introduced me to Hidan Chaba, who had this lineage and used what he knew for a lot of experimental archaeology work. So Chaba was enamored of the fact that I was both an academic and a fencer, which most folks tend to be either one or the other. HEMA is very strange in the presupposition that many, a lot of us are actually doing research and fencing at the same time. That's really, really unusual. And I was an early exponent of that, and I trained with him the entire time that me and the manuscript grubbers were hauling these manuscripts out of archives all over the place. Guys like Steve Hick and the stuff, and if you know any of the HEMA history, we don't need to go over that for a half an hour. Did a lot of training with him.
That's fantastic. So what drew you to? That's how you learned about Hungarian fencing. And actually, I appreciate the. I'm trying to find an image of the guy in your book that you mentioned, Chaba. You paid homage to him. There he is, giving tips and facts in your book. I appreciate that immensely. Also, side note, whoever drew the images in your book, they are on choice. Those are fantastic.
That is Kat Laurent. She is a professional illustrator, and if you like that style, get in touch with me and I will get in touch with her. We need to bury her in business. She is awesome. And we work really, really hard trying to figure out how to illustrate it, because nothing will give you sympathy for all those old manuscripts like trying to put one of these together yourself. It is really hard to draw something in a way that accurately conveys what you're trying to depict. And photographs actually tend to provide less information in many cases than a drawing does if you can figure out how to get it right. The learning curve was really steep. Hungarian Sabre itself is, in some ways, sort of a precursor for many of the lineages that folks take for granted where Sabre is concerned. The Hatvagás, or the 6 cuts, for example, are the primary basis for late 18th and 19th century British saber, although they take it in a slightly different direction that's not quite as elaborated. The Hussars who flee Hungary during the Rockwoolsey Rebellion and wind up in France form the Hussar tradition in France and espadon fencing, which is different than counterpoint and goes away after the Napoleonic era. Many of those guys then flee eastern France during the Revolution and return to Hungary. You've got all this history tied up with the introduction of Hussar cavalry and the use of the saber in Europe. And it's just a really neat set of systems, especially once you start working in the false edge, which is pretty much, if there's one thing that distinguishes Hungarian saber, it's the false edge is real. So if the Hungarians throw about 50% of their cuts with the false edge, the next in line are basically the Italians who will use it 5% of the time. And for everybody else, it's an every now and then kind of thing. So if you're doing medieval swordplay or early Renaissance swordplay with all these false edge cuts, the Hungarian stuff is a no-brainer, because look at all your Meisterhau, look at all your various other things you do with it. Why doesn't that survive? It does survive over here. It doesn't survive in all these other places, at least to any great extent. So I found that very attractive. I was in Maryland once with Stephen Hick of the Manuscript Grubbers, and he asked me to show off the Hungarian Sabre stuff. Now, I knew nothing about Kunsteffekten at the time. I'd been pulling manuscripts out of archives, but I hadn't had a chance to actually go in and read any of it because I limp in German. And medieval High German, Middle High German, no, Middle High German was arcane to me at the time. It may as well have been Anglo-Norman. So I showed him a bunch of the techniques. And he went, "Those are fabulous, Winden. Where did you learn them?" And I looked at him and I said, "What's a Winden?" because I literally had no idea. And he basically said, well, I got this 15th century manuscript, and you just did a crap ton of the techniques out of that manuscript. What? So the idea that that stuff was preserved all the way into World War I Hungary and was taken for granted as prototypically Hungarian stuff, to the point where Arlo, when he's actually fusing the Austrian and the Italian, or the Hungarian and the Italian methods, preserves the false edge cuts, calling them the good old Hungarian cuts. It's really weird stuff.
Well, isn't that just being on brand for a lot of the Eastern European histories? They preserve the stuff that other nations have seen as outdated and do it so perfectly well that they become a staple part of the rest of Europe. You see it with Hungarian Hussars and what you just mentioned as well, the swordsmanship techniques. So before I get too far, what I did want to ask is you were on the topic of comparing the Hungarian tradition to other saber traditions, and I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about that.
Sure.
I myself have, before I picked up your book, I was exclusively, I guess you'd call it an English tradition saberer.
Okay.
Wrist Moulinets and all of that fun stuff. So,
You were a Roworth guy?
no, believe it or not Roworth. I practiced Thomas Stevens from the American Civil War, who he himself drew tradition from other English authors. He was English before emigrating. But Hutton was where I got my first start, as where most of us probably who have been doing nothing but longsword and rapier, we hear about this guy named Hutton, and his book is readily available, so we start there.
I'm going to try really hard not to wince and make an ass out of myself on your podcast now. Hutton is a terrible place for people to start with Saber. Can I rant about Hutton for a second?
Do it, please.
And praise him
I
at the
love
same
it.
time?
Yes.
Hutton did a really good job of trying to popularize the old schools of fencing, but he was not a particularly significant fencer. Castle was a vastly more significant figure on the stage. Corbel was a significantly more significant figure on the stage. Those guys don't get enough credit. What a lot of folks don't realize about Hutton is Hutton himself knew the saber stuff from cold steel was bad. He took a bunch of foil parries and he put them together in ways that don't work well, and I won't bore the podcast by dissecting it. But he himself realized, ooh, I didn't do a good job on that. That's why within the space of 3 or 4 years, he had already put out The Swordsman, which is a much, much better saber text. So if you're going to start with Hutton, go get a copy of The Swordsman, read Cold Steel, sit in the back of your head and go, people have problems with that, and I don't understand why, but I'll find out later. But The Swordsman is your Hutton text to work with, not Cold Steel. And then I'm going to get all kinds of hate for the next 6 years for having said that, but it's true. And I can tear it apart and I can dissect it on technical grounds some very other time.
So, but taking that kind of English Western tradition of saber,
Yep.
would you consider it, I suppose you'd say, a relative familiar, in along the same path as Eastern saber traditions, or how separate or how similar are these two worlds in your?
Okay, so the first thing that happens is that we in the English language historiography, and I'm not saying you do this specifically, but many people do, have a tendency to go, oh, Eastern Europe, and treat it like it's a monolith. It's not. It's not only as diverse as Western Europe, in many ways, it's culturally more diverse than Western Europe. There are lots of differences, and those differences matter. And the fencing traditions, you get hints of here and there, even though there was so much warfare that preservation of things was much, much harder. We can't throw everything into a bucket. So, for example, we know that Hungarian and Polish stuff tend to be different in the 17th century. The Hungarians never use a thumb ring. The Poles rarely have any false edges on their sabers. You see it in Meyer, but it's not a big deal later on. So British saber keeps the wrist moulinet. Le Marchand pulls from Austrian cavalry training. The 6 cuts of British fencing are literally the hatvagash, or the 6 cuts of Hussar saber work. The wrist moulinet is standard. cart over the arm exists because the Hungarians are using techniques like this all the time, and they preserved one or two of them. What gets different is that the British begin to marry it to French small sword play. And in many cases, we have in British play a little bit of false edge here, and then a lot of, I need to put this in a shell that makes sense for my small sword. There's not a lot of fencing tradition in Napoleonic Britain. There's a bunch earlier with the backsword stuff, and it's really neat stuff. But by the time you get into the Napoleonic era, French saber play is very, very rudimentary. If you're going to go somewhere and get stationed somewhere where you need it, you go learn it. It's not a huge traditional thing outside of single stick, which is going wild. Single stick is everywhere. It's nuts. Single stick should be its own discipline without even needing to pretend to be sword fencing. It should be totally preserved. If somebody actually has a living lineage or a near living lineage of single stick, they need to prioritize that and not apologize for it. So when you see the various guards, you'll start to see the temptation, and Hutton is not an outlier for doing this, to say, here are foil guards, here are, I'm going to emphasize playing against the point or even with the point, and working with various forms of defenses that are prioritized for that. So if I turn, for example, left protect and right protect, this is, how do I have a saber and I got to really deal with a bayonet, B, small sworders, guys who do really high quality point fencing, because a small sword is a terror weapon if you know how to use it well. They are really, really scary. Well, left protect and right protect don't really exist in the Austrian systems because they're using the hell out of the false edge. And if I press your blade aside and you're a good false edge guy, you're going to use the tempo I've given you to use your disengagement in time to pull my hand off. You'll go right underneath that with the false edge, and you're guaranteeing that you get hit. In fact, I sailed through pools at Brass Frog, even though I was feeling bad and my back was out, mostly on that single technique. I happened to have a way of cutting that the guards that the people who had done Western fencing didn't have an answer for. If you know it's coming, then you have an easy answer. You also disengage in time and you do a counter riposte to the outside of the arm. Done. It's not a magic formula. It's just most of the Western saber fencing doesn't know the false edge.
I'm glad you brought that was a fantastic comparison. I'm glad, and I wanted to bring back to the point that you brought up that a lot of the world, or a lot of the historical fencing community, doesn't see the difference. They kind of categorize Western saber and Eastern fencing, or Eastern saber. And it isn't like that, as you brought up. And I was leading to my next question too, because Polish saber considers to be I suppose you'd say the standard when people consider Eastern saber. And I wanted to get your thoughts on why you think that might be, and also the differences between Hungarian and Polish, and other Eastern European nations and traditions, if you're familiar with them.
The basic issue with Polish saber is that you're having to engage in a lot of experimental archaeology. Now, I made my bread and butter in experimental archaeology. Half of the historical papers I published, some of which are actually still part of the historiography and referenced in my previous life as a scholar, came out of insights from experimental archaeology. The HEMA world takes it not quite seriously. We have a great deal of, by the 19th century, is it mostly Prussian? How much do the earlier things survive? Well, the answer is we don't know. We do know some characteristic features remain, one of which is if you have a saber that's using a thumb ring, you know, A, it's not being used in either hand, because try fencing left-handed with a right-handed thumb ring saber. It's misery squared. You can do it, it's really hard, and the sabers that have the thumb rings are balanced for cavalry use, so posting on the back of the grip is not going to work well for you. We know they don't use much false edge. We presume they have a lot in common with Prussian fencing. The Austrians and the Prussians are well aware of hellish court, or what for the Brits and Hungarians is cut 3. You can see Austrian saber manuals where they're labeling cut 3, also known as Polish Hellish Court. So it is very clear that the Poles exercised a real influence. It is not clear from a manuscript basis to what degree, by the time we get into my era, you can say there is strictly Polish fencing versus there is a general set of fencing that has gone international in Northeastern Europe, and we're still picking apart who's who and what's what to see what the differences are. So Polish fencing in America makes a lot of sense. We've got a lot of ethnic Poles with a long storied history. Polish Hussars have been made popular all over the place. And popularizing saber doesn't break my little heart at all. I've been in a teeny tiny corner of the HEMA world for years and years because for 20 or 25 years, nobody cared at all about saber except for a few historical reenactors. So the folks popularizing Polish saber are doing me a great big favor on the side because I happen to do a related thing by it.
That's fantastic. I had one follow-up question, but beforehand I did want to point out for those who aren't familiar, at the end of your book, you have two translations of Hungarian military manuals from later on. And it wasn't until I had made my way through your entire book before I realized, oh my goodness, you've got these translations at the very end, and you do an analysis of them, which I absolutely love that. As a historian, that's the kind of stuff that I get giddy over. I wanted to make sure that the viewers were aware of that, but also I wanted to get your thoughts on it too, on the translation or transcription of these manuals in comparison. And you included a section on the end of it, you know, the tradition. The Hungarian saber tradition versus that you've brought to life in the book compared to the ones that we have in the manuals.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could touch on that a little bit as well.
All right. So not all of them later. So for example, Timlik that Maximilian graciously allowed me to use, which he will hopefully be publishing on soon. The full translation is done. I think he's just looking for a publisher, and 2020 hasn't been kind to anybody, so that's been delayed. Well, he graciously allowed me to use that material, and that was published 1798. And his manual has sign-off from a who's who of the Hungarian military aristocracy. So you can look at Timlik and go, oh, cuirassier fencing. This is the stuff that Le Marchand was grabbing. So if you wanted to come from a British perspective and go, hey, where's my stuff come from? Go grab Timlik. And you'll see immediately where the similarities are, as well as a whole bunch of stuff you can practice if you see any holes in your own stuff that you want to explore. Then we have Chapon, who is, in my opinion, out of that Espadon tradition that gets really odd. He does a bunch of foil play, as do most saber guys of the period. If you want to do saber, at some point you should also practice foil. And the reason is that everybody in the period recognized the importance of thrust fencing and being able to maintain distance so you didn't get ganked. And that didn't matter if you were on foot or mounted. You still had to deal with guys who had bayonets. You had better be able to judge distance and timing, because a bayonet may be heavy and a bayonet may be slow, but you still don't want to get stuck with it. So I don't know if you want me to go into different stylistic differences, but those translations are in there, and I'm hoping somebody runs with it and plays with it. Chapon's manual itself tends to be a glorious mess, but the meat inside it is just hilariously interesting because he does passing retreats on many of his parries. And that changes the footwork game significantly. When you can do a standard retreat or a passing retreat on every parry, the granularity of your footwork goes to the moon.
I didn't need you to dive too much into that, but that was exactly what I was hoping to get into, some of the details of it. So I did eventually want to get into some, I suppose you'd say, viewer questions. I also have some questions from my students, but I did want to end a back and forth between us with to I guess ask a question that's more, I suppose you'd say, contradictory, or it's been
controversial.
It's been a hot topic in the HEMA community for it. So I wanted to ask, from what I've noticed, in terms of martial arts stuff that doesn't have an actual treatise that we can translate and study from. A lot of people out there, I have heard, don't consider it HEMA proper. And I was wondering what your this has been something I noticed. There are some tournaments out there that will say, well, you have to use a style that was around, we're going to end it in the year 1600, you have to use a style before that. And they don't allow things like the fencing traditions from the East, even though sabers were around from that era. So what I wanted to ask you was, is what you do in your mind HEMA, and what are your thoughts on that topic overall? Or if it is not HEMA, what is it a part of?
I tend to refer to it as historical fencing precisely because there are a bunch of folks who don't consider any of the living lineage as HEMA. That's prerogative. People can define the world the way they want to. As far as I'm concerned, if it's historical fencing, it falls under the umbrella of HEMA. If people don't care for that, that's their orange juice, and they can drink it as much as they like. I'm unusual because I'm a body mechanics specialist. Just like a good dancer can shift from waltz to foxtrot to samba to name your style, I have no problem fencing in 3 or 4 very distinct styles, and I can change them up on the fly. So I can play Italian, I can play Italo-Hungarian, I can play pure Austrian, I can play French, I can even play a little bit of Prussian, although don't tell the people who play Prussian because they'll look at it and go, nope, you got your Vaga wrong, your alignments are off, etc. So if somebody says, yeah, play this other thing, I can do that. That doesn't bother me at all. And I've been around long enough to get exposure to it that will let me limp along in a tournament presentably. But at the end of the day, it's a controversy that doesn't really matter to me a whole lot because I've been training and living in complete obscurity so far as Hemistan is concerned for most of my adult life. And if it stays that way, it's literally just continuation of the same.
Great. I like that. So with that, thank you for sharing that. I wanted to jump into some of the fan questions. And I think you've touched on some of these too. I have them written on a whiteboard over here, so if I'm going to look over to the side.
Sure, hit me.
On these, but I know that these guys would like to know a bit more and a bit deeper about it. And for those of you viewing right now, please write in the comment section of the video as we cover these. It does take a couple minutes for the comments to get through. So please comment and we'll get to it as soon as you can. But I've got a couple lined up, ready and good to go. From Ray, he wanted to know a little bit more about how the fencing tradition is preserved in Hungary.
Fencing at large is still huge in Hungary. Hungary is a relatively small nation of 10 million people that if it does not dominate saber fencing, it is the you have to deal with them period of saber fencing. The international fencing rules that form the basis of modern Olympic fencing were literally written by a Hungarian. They were translated into French because people read more French than they read Hungarian, but it was literally written by a Hungarian guy. Most of our concepts of right-of-way and what the rules are for judging who's getting hit are coming out of the Italo-Hungarian tradition. The difficulty with stuff like what I was doing, well, is it got preserved in Romania, and it got preserved on the side, and it came from one of these individualistic drill masters who was sort of doing his own thing. It's outside the main corpus. But saber itself is a cultural weapon for the Hungarians to the same degree that the tachi and katana are for the Japanese. It is alive and well in Hungary. It stands no chance of going away. Historical saber is as respected as sports saber, even though they're very different things. You'll see it all the time, all over the place. And they can read many of the manuals in the original. So they'll pull out one of the two Chapon brothers or the daddy, if they still read German, and they'll just go at it and play with it. Hungarians, in my experience, tend to be more enamored of the rapier and the longsword when they first get into historical fencing, simply because they're so inundated in saber that they're bored by it. Many of them tend to look at saber the same way we look at, oh, do I have to learn foil? Because it's everywhere. Well, it's everywhere because they've got it and they're really, really good at it. And if you look at, for example, Aron Szilárd at the Olympics, All you got to do is put a heavier weapon in his hand and slow him down, and you'll see a great many of the historical techniques being performed right up there on the strip. In fact, he's really particularly known for several very basic counter riposts that any single stick guy would take for granted. And I'm not going to unpack that. I'll let you go explore it yourself if you're interested.
Fantastic. The next question that brought up, which I believe is fairly similar to it, and you touched on this earlier as well. Steve asks, is there a focus within Hungary in terms of the style? So for example, in England, every different author has a different style, a different focus. Is there something like that in Hungary? And if so, would you consider your tradition that you wrote down in here a particular style, or at least not of this other style?
I would consider it a variation on a theme. There is a significant difference for the lineage that I wound up being in, and that's that it is a pure center line system, and we don't know why it got taught as a pure center line system. Because the guys doing it couldn't talk about it under Ceausescu. That's bad business. Most of the Hungarian systems have real variations, but we do see certain things in common, and one of them is the use of the false edge. And when you've really weaponized the false edge to where every second or every third cut is a false edge cut, it changes your understanding of the guards alarmingly. And many of the things that you go, oh, I've closed that line. No, you have not closed that line. You've actually set them up for a brutal remise. And so you have to play the angles very differently. So combine that with the fact that you've got Hungarian authors who are all over the map. Konstantin Balasha, for example, teaches swordplay that is closer visually to Fabri or to the Jena school of foil than it is to anything Italian. You can't say that there's a real focus until you get to the false edge. And if you look at the false edge, that's just as Hungarian as paprika.
All right. Fantastic. So, another question that was brought up. You do practice swordsmanship, sparring, or at least have it within your school. Can you share a bit of your kit, specifically on a saber that you recommend for practicing Hungarian styles?
I don't have it. I don't have the stuff to hand because it's actually up to the school. But in terms of kit, I recommend regular old HEMA stuff. I recommend old Taekwondo chest protectors. I recommend, in fact, I've become a meme in certain circles on the internet over on Discord. Get a stick. When you're first starting out, if you have any decent control, there's absolutely no reason not to start with a stick if you're not sure you really want to do it. Once you know how to do it, yeah, go to town. Silk Fencing sells great synthetics. The Purple Heart synthetics that I help work with Christian are really consistent, and a whole group of people will have the exact same curve and the exact same balance, and that helps a lot for technical work. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of HEMA town tends to overthink the gear. When I was training with Chava, we had leftover World War I helmets, some assorted karate pads, and stuff we were sewing together with felt, just to make sure we wouldn't accidentally bust any bones. And it worked just fine. And once I got back in the States and was able to borrow gear from people, I never had any problems holding my own with folks who've been training with much more elaborate gear. And every HEMA merchant in America now hates my name. But once you know you're into it, you'll know the kind of gear you want to use. Until you do, don't spend the money until you know you're going to, because you might wind up with a different focus, and you don't want to be one of these guys with $400 of gear sitting around you never use, trying to get a decent price for it.
All right. Fantastic. So, do you have any projects that you yourself, you've published many books, you are an instructor. Do you have any projects, written or otherwise, that you are working on that you'd like to share with us, or that you've recently completed and are proud of?
I just finished a translation with Salan Andrash of Lissac's Austro-Hungarian Sabre Fencing. It's an Italo-Hungarian method that forms the basis of a lot of modern saber, and that's available alongside the Hussar book. And I'm currently working between myself and my wife with translating Gustav Arlo, who is really where the Austro-Hungarian winds up meeting the Italian, and he's sorting back and forth through it and goes, okay, I'm going to put together a method, and here it is, and it'll preserve a bunch of this and a bunch of that. So that'll be hopefully coming out at the end of the year.
All right, fantastic. Before we wind up and wrap things up, is there anything that you wanted to expand upon that we talked about but weren't able to, or is there any other final thoughts that you'd like to share with everybody?
If we're going to talk about the saber, one thing I'd really like to say is that saber pedagogy is what sells saber. There's a joke in some places, come for the longsword, save the saber. That's not true. Longsword's got a lot going for it. But if you really enjoy an elaborated pedagogy, there is a lot more to saber than just 6 cuts and 5 blocks. There is decades worth of material to master in there. And it is much more than the simplified systems that most people get exposed to. Most people don't realize that the Anglo-British systems that are showing saber are showing the bare bones. It's saber fencing, absolutely, but it's the bare bones meant for people who are trying to familiarize themselves with a service weapon so that they can do good service if, for God's sake, they have to draw it because you're getting into bad war. Because one side's charge didn't retreat and the other side refuses to hold their ground, and now everybody's going to take 30 or 40% casualties and have their unit wiped off the board. No one wants this. But they do want you to be good enough with your saber that if you've got to hold that ground, you're not going to be torn to mincemeat by a bunch of really scared guys with bayonets. If you want to get past that into one-on-one dueling, there is a tremendous amount of depth, and the more you know the depth, the more you start to get little I win buttons in your pocket. And the more little dirty tricks you have, the harder it is for an opponent to adjust to it. And if they can't adjust to your dirty tricks, then you have a really good afternoon. And people are like, how does he do that? And that's sneaky and fun. And anybody who does other historical methods where they also have dirty tricks, Crumpo, will tell you how fun those are. Or small sword. And cortada. Everybody has their little sneaky tricks. It's part of the fun of fencing. So saber has them too. It's not just 6 cuts, 6 guards done.
I appreciate that too. As a saber fencer myself, I'm really glad that you brought that up. And honestly, I can tell that happens in the Hungarian tradition, and from the little bit that I've looked into Polish fencing as well, it's so deep. It's deeper than you can think about. And I appreciate that you brought that up.
Yeah, just being able to make a cut 3. It is really hard not to double against a cut 3 unless you know how to handle it. I mean, there's a reason that everybody's really impressed with Hellish Court. It's a hard cut to defend against once your opponent knows how to throw it well.
Great. Fantastic. Well, with that, you guys, I want to highly recommend the book Hungarian Hussar Fencing and Fokos Hussar Sabre and Fokos Fencing. You can get it very readily available on Amazon, and then you can take a look at Russ's other books that he has published as well. I think most of those are available on Amazon as well. Highly recommend checking it out. And if you are in the Texas area, feel free to check out Winged Saber Historical Fencing through Warlord Combat Academy. And with that, Russ, stick around afterwards, but I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. We had a lot of viewers here. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around and joining us this morning for our coffee. And with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your weekend. And thank you, Russ, for joining us.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.